Our first presentation today is The Long Game, Managing Risk by Investing in Community, and with Liz Carlisle. Liz has a PhD, is an associate professor in the Environmental Studies program at UC Santa Barbara, where she teaches courses on food and farming. Born and raised in Montana, she got hooked on agriculture while working as an aide to an organic farmer and U.S. Senator John Tester, which led to a decade of research and writing collaborations with farmers in her home state. Please join me in welcoming Liz.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Good morning. It's always so great to be in a room with the organic community. I feel instantly at home. There's some folks here who I've known for a while, and some of you who I think I'm just meeting today. So I think I'll start off by saying a little bit about myself and what brings me to the organic community and why I think what we do matters so much. And a little bit about this idea around the long game, why I think we have a lot to offer the world in approaching our work from this standpoint of the long game, certainly within agriculture, but I would also venture that we have a lot to offer even beyond agriculture in the way that we problem solve, basically. So again, my name is Liz Carlisle. You heard about my current work. I teach at the University of California, Santa Barbara in our undergraduate environmental studies program. I'm the food and ag gal. So I get students out on farms, get their hands dirty. People love to get out and see where their food comes from, of course. So this is amazing work. But my deep reason for being involved in organics actually goes back a couple of generations. My grandmother, Helen Gordon, actually lost our family farm in the Dust Bowl. So she grew up on a family farm in western Nebraska, but as many of you know, the Dust Bowl in the late 20s and early 30s in the Grain Belt in North America took a real toll on a lot of small family farms, and theirs was no exception. They lost their farm. They lost their livelihood. The family actually had to split up. She went and lived with another family to do chores to kind of get back on their feet economically. So it was a real trauma in my family history that time. But you know, they figured things out. She became an educator, and I was lucky to have her in my life. She lived into her 90s, so she was around until I was 30. And I really loved her stories about growing up on that small family farm. They were organic by necessity. You know, they didn't have the money for synthetic chemicals, and it was really just the beginning of some of the more advanced machinery as well. They did a lot of stuff with animals, and she just had this super strong connection to land. And it felt to me like that's what made her so grounded and so wise. In many ways, that's what made her the woman I admired and the woman I wanted to be. She was grounded in a connection to land. Even after losing the farm, that childhood really had an indelible impact on her. So that was one thing that my grandmother gave me, was that yearning to reconnect with land in that way. And the other thing she gave me was she was so honest about what went wrong. She knew that her dad had overplowed that land. The implements were too heavy, too many passes. Probably some of the cropping systems weren't appropriate for the land that they were on. And she really wanted our society to figure out a better way to work with land, to grow food, but to work with land rather than against land. And so she told me everything that she understood about what went wrong in those Dust Bowl times. And she really encouraged me to be part of a movement for healthy soil. She passed while I was still working on my first book with organic farmers in Montana, but I talked with her every week when I was working on that project, and she was so happy to know that I was doing that work. She really felt like that was some of the most important work we could do for humanity's future, Because if we're not taking care of the land, we're really not setting ourselves up to have, stable communities where we can be in that mutual relationship with each other and with the places where we live. So that's really what brought me to the organic community, was that inspiration from my grandmother, and then being lucky to meet some organic farmers around me growing up in Montana. The first organic farmer that I really knew about was John Tester when he ran for U.S. Senate. I was lucky to get to go work in his office, and through him, to really get to know you all, this incredible organic community throughout this whole region that, of course, he and his work came out of, all the collective insights that have been developed here about organic rotations and organic fertility and organic pest management, but also so much more about how we build really an alternative rural economy together. So I want to talk a little bit about that work today in this context of this theme of the long game and the way that organic farmers invest in community, which again I think is so important as something that we have to offer all of agriculture, but also really our broader economy, our broader society, as we work to solve some really challenging problems that we all are running into together. And so I think here's the context in which organic farmers have really come to this important insight. And that's that farming, it's inherently risky. You all know this, but it's even riskier in 2024, right? You all are encountering enormous amounts of risk. And why is that? Well, some of that is the weather, it's the climate, right? All of these extreme weather events. To get here, I had to drive to the airport yesterday through such high winds. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to make it. The car was kind of blowing all over the road, and then there was a wildfire that started. So I was driving through wildfire smoke and high winds and was just reminded there's a lot of this going on these days, right? Fire, drought, heavy flooding events, and farmers are on the front lines of these challenges. This makes farming really risky. And markets, too, are super volatile in this day and age, right? And not all of that is even predictable. Something can happen all the way around the world, and all of a sudden, oh man, that changes the global price of wheat, or maybe the price of an input that a farmer's relying upon. So because of this landscape of so much risk, surviving as a farmer in this environment, it's really all about managing this risk. And that's really hard when it feels like, most of the things I described aren't really under your control. It's not really about, are you managing your farm well, right? That doesn't necessarily mean there's not a wildfire in the community next to you. That doesn't necessarily mean there's not a big change in the global price of wheat. So it's frustrating. And it's particularly frustrating because even as you're facing all of these large-scale risks and challenges, the metrics of success in farming tend to be so individual, right? I mean, the success of a single crop in a single year, or a single farm in a single year. And it's hard when you're dealing with these very large-scale phenomena that you don't have a lot of control over, but then you're being evaluated on these very individual levels. And so organic farmers have faced all of this squarely and figured out, I think, tapped into this ancient insight that when you're dealing with a lot of risk that you may not be able to control, the only durable way to manage that over the long term is to spread it out and find a way to tackle it together. Or, we might say, organic farmers understand that you need to invest in your community if you want to be around for the long haul. And I want to talk just briefly about 3 ways in which I see organic farmers investing in community. This won't be news to any of you. This is kind of more like an organic pep rally. But I'm going to sprinkle in maybe a few things that might be useful to you as you communicate with maybe your customers, maybe policymakers, other people around you who are important in supporting organic. Some recent research that helps me communicate these things in ways that sometimes travel beyond those of us who kind of know this by heart and by experience at this point. So one place where organic farmers invest, obviously, is in the plant community, in this incredible diversity of plants that you see on an organic farm that you wouldn't necessarily see in a more conventional commodity farm that's focused on just 1 or 2 plants. And I really learned this lesson for the first time in my very first project that I took on, coming out of the tester office, then as a graduate student. I was fortunate to get to know a lot of the folks around John Tester who had been part of this movement for organic in Montana. And a lot of these folks I found were marketing their lentils through a business called Timeless Seeds. And so I learned this whole fascinating story of, there'd been a bunch of farmers in Montana who were in commodity wheat. There was the farm crisis in the 80s. Everybody realized, dang, it's going to be hard to keep making it in commodity wheat, right? Wheat prices are low, input prices are high. A couple drought years really showcased the kind of ecological fragility of this monocultural system. And so this group of farmers in Montana started asking themselves, well, what if we didn't want to be dependent on synthetic inputs that we have to buy that go up and down in price depending on global fossil fuel markets? What if we didn't want to have to take a price from the global wheat market that's not really based on the quality of our crop? In other words, what if we wanted to go organic? And they started asking themselves, what would we need to do on the farm to make that viable, to have a biological source of fertility, and to have enough sort of pest and weed and disease control to feel comfortable letting go of the herbicides and the other tools like that? And so long story short, folks did a lot of experimenting. There's this really cool structure called farm improvement clubs through which they did some more systematic experimenting. And they hit on pulse crops as a key rotation crop that would keep a legume in the rotation, certainly a cover crop year here and there, but having a pulse crop as being part of what would make that organic farming rotation work as a sort of integrated whole that didn't require the synthetic fertilizers and gave a little bit more of that diversity, rotating through different families of crops to also get off of the synthetic tools for pest control. So this was the story of what I came to call the lentil underground. And this is one of the farms that I visited, Vilikas Farms, Doug and Anna Jones Crabtree's farm up in North Havre, Montana, where I saw a lot of this investing in the plant community. I think the rotation the year I was there included 24 different kinds of plants, and that was just the crops, not including all of the non-crop habitat that was up there too. And as I was visiting these farms in Montana who were selling through Timeless Seeds, who were part of the lentil underground, I was struck by two things. And one was just the incredible degree of additional diversity on the Montana agricultural landscape as a result of this pulse crop revolution. I was born in 1984 in Missoula, Montana. And I think it's fair to say there basically weren't any lentils planted in the state at that time. I could have done a cross-state trip with my parents looking really hard, and we probably wouldn't have seen any out there in the field. But by the time I was doing this research in 2012, there were 200,000 acres in lentils in Montana. So really an extraordinary amount of new diversity on the landscape where you had seen really just wheat and barley out there before. And I was also struck as I thought about that season in particular when I was out there. And I should say, these 200,000 acres, that wasn't just Timeless Seeds and organic farms. Other farmers caught on, and this diversity moved into the conventional market as well. But I was just looking at these organic farms that were selling through Timeless Seeds. That's what I was there to do in 2012. And I was, of course, hoping it would be a good year to do field research, that I would see a lot of plants growing, that farmers would have a lot of stories to share. And so I was really nervous when I realized that this wasn't looking like it was going to be such a great season. Some of you probably remember 2012, right? That was a pretty gnarly drought year. And as I was driving around visiting folks, a lot of their neighbors' farms were not looking so good. You were starting to see crops dry up. You were seeing people just plow stuff under that they figured wasn't even worth spending the money to harvest. But within this group of farmers that I was visiting with, the folks who were doing the rotations, the folks who were organic, the folks who were marketing through Timeless Seeds, which was kind of my case study, they estimated, the grower services person who was visiting everybody estimated that folks were getting about 40% of their typical precipitation that year, so really not a lot of moisture, but still, according to the product that they were bringing in, the lentils they were bringing in, still 80% of typical yields. So to me, that was an incredible story of climate resilience. And it was related clearly to this investing in the plant community, of having these diverse rotations. And there's other researchers who have found this doing larger studies, sort of systematically combining lots of data from lots of farms. This is a recent one that's mostly farms that have corn in the rotation. A lot of farms that are a little bit further east, kind of more in the US Midwestern corn belt. And they found that indeed, investing in the plant community, so more crop rotation diversification, does increase resilience, and particularly in these adverse conditions, in these drought years. So this team looked at 11 different experiments that together comprise 347 site years of yield data. So 1 year, one site is a site year. And what they found was that more diverse rotations increased yields of corn all the time, so an average of 28% across all different kinds of years, good years, bad years, high moisture, low moisture, but they were particularly helpful in drought years. So yield losses were reduced 14 to up to 89.9% in drought years for these farms that had more diverse rotations. This is a picture of the Marsden farm at Iowa State, which is one of these 11 experiments that they looked at that did a long-term study on this. So investing in the plant community really does make a difference with this resilience for the long game. And of course, the reason why, and organic farmers know this better than anybody, is that, yeah, you're investing in your plant community and your plant diversity, but what are your plants investing in? They're investing in the soil community, right? And that's where a lot of the resilience is coming from. So another study actually looked at this relationship between diversity in the plant community and diversity in the soil community. And this was in a totally different system. This was in vegetable cropping systems in California's Central Valley. So we were just in maize in the Midwest, in Illinois and Iowa. Now we're in diversified vegetable farming in the Central Valley of California. And this researcher, Aide Guzman, wanted to know if farms that had higher diversity of crops also had higher diversity below ground in the soil microbial community, and particularly with indicators, soil microbes that would indicate things of importance to soil health. And so she found 30 farms in the Central Valley. I don't know if I can start this video, but maybe I'll look over here and see if somebody could show us. This is some drone footage of one of the farms that she looked at. So she found 30 farms in the Central Valley. Some of them were highly diverse. Some of them were just growing one vegetable crop. She chose squash as a focal crop because there were some farms that were just growing squash, some that were growing squash, but lots of other things in these kind of rotated blocks. And so she looked at these farms, and she studied a bunch of things. She looked at pollinator diversity, but she also looked at below-ground biodiversity by looking specifically at arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi and how many different types of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi these farms had. And she found that the polyculture farms had 2 times as many types of these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that are so important for things like infiltration, carbon sequestration, other ecosystem services provided by soil. So here you can see a little flyover of, you know this story about how beautiful some of these farms are that are so diverse, right? But this was the kind of farm that had that critical soil health. And this was particularly surprising in the Central Valley because these farms were typically on land that had had very low organic matter before the farmer got there because of the history of management being more this industrial monocultural management. And so they had managed to bring these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi back in with, in some cases, 5 to 10 years of this kind of management of more diversified cropping systems. So here again, this is a kind of specific place-based study. But then there are also studies that have kind of looked systematically, review papers that have synthesized a lot of different research. And this is one on this question of using these diversified cropping rotations, using these soil health practices, what does it do for things we really care about with soil function, like infiltration, things we really care about when we think about climate resilience and how farms and rural communities are going to weather all of this extreme weather that comes with climate change. So this was one of these systematic studies that Andrea Beisch from University of Nebraska and Marcia DeLong, who was then at the Union of Concerned Scientists, did. And they looked at 126 different experiments that tested one or more of the soil health practices that you see in the graph there. And they found that in 70% of these experiments, that continuous living cover, meaning folks who were either using perennials or cover crops or both, improved in 70% actually improved infiltration overall, and continuous living cover improved it the most. So even some of these other practices improved it somewhat, but the continuous living cover improved it the most. And I thought this was really striking. They found that farmers could make as much as 16% more water available to crops in droughts by using combinations of these soil health practices. And the bars there show how much infiltration improved with these particular practices. And that's how they came up with the insight that the continuous living cover, the sort of roots in the ground all year round, were the most effective. And they found not only that the water came into the soil profile, but that it was more likely to stay there, specifically because cover crops and perennials were increasing porosity as they looked across these experiments by an average of 8%. And it might not sound like a lot, but functionally, that was pretty dramatic to have this extra space between soil particles to allow water to move into and through soil. So infiltration, water could come in when there was a heavy rain event, not necessarily run all the way off the field, stay there if there were going to be many, many years or many months of not a whole lot of moisture, and then stay there, right? So being able to manage water so it came in when you wanted it to come in, stay there so you could use it when you needed to, rather than having it sort of just run right through the soil profile. And I also really loved this part of their study, which I think is something that maybe we don't talk about enough as a sort of ecosystem service that we in the organic community can provide to the rural communities around us, which is that these folks who were using these soil health practices, who were storing this water on the farm, obviously very useful for their own crops when things got dry, but also helpful to their neighbors, because when that water wasn't running off, not only was it not creating the water quality problems that we know come with runoff, but also in these really heavy rain events, they were reducing the chance of flood for the people around them by storing some of that water. And you just think about, if we extend these practices to the landscape level, how much of a difference might that make to rural communities and rural infrastructure? So I think what you all know is that it's hard to invest in the plant community, invest in the soil community. Our agricultural economy isn't necessarily set up to reward these practices. And so you can't really make long-term investments in these things on the farm without support from the human community. And I think that might actually be the most important insight that organic farmers understand. This is something that I have heard organic farmers say a lot. And I think specifically of Bob Quinn, who I worked with on a book a few years ago. He said this many, 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 many times in our conversations. I think he wanted to make sure that this made it into the book. It's like, this is a core philosophy for him. And I think for a lot of people is understanding that there's so much pressure to consolidate in the agricultural sector. And we see it all around us, right? We see private equity firms buying up land. We see all along the supply chain this kind of get big or get out pressure that's been there for decades now. But I see organic farmers pushing back and saying, we need each other. We need to have neighbors who can be part of managing landscapes together. We need to have this sort of mutual understanding. We need to be able to help each other out. We need to have small businesses. We need to have local food economies. And so, yeah, I'd rather have the neighbor than the neighbor's land. And I've seen this in some interesting ways in some of these other studies that I told you about as well. This is Aide Guzman, whose study I was mentioning, who looked at the connection between above ground and below ground biodiversity. And the human community piece of her study was really interesting because these farmers that she found in the Central Valley who had all of this plant diversity, I don't know if any of you did a double take when I said, oh, she found all these really highly diverse farms in the Central Valley. But when she presented her research to her dissertation committee and her plan, their first question was, where are you going to find a bunch of highly diverse farms in the Central Valley? And she said, oh, I know. Because she grew up in a farm worker family, and she knew a bunch of people who were growing cultural foods. They were kind of, off the radar of the agricultural establishment. But she said, these people are out there with these diverse farms. And sure enough, they were. She had enough to have a statistically viable study. But the point is that basically all of the people that she worked with who had these diversified farms were pretty recent immigrants from Mexico, Central America, refugees from Southeast Asia. And so another piece of this investing in the human community, it's about, supporting small businesses, it's about supporting local food systems. And I think what I see, as I think about my own background in Montana, I think we have this existential question about whether we in rural communities can also welcome people who are different than us and whose visions and cultural heritage make our communities more vibrant and resilient. As these farmers that Ide worked with were doing with their cultural foods, adding all this plant diversity that then was adding to the below ground biodiversity that was really restoring, in many ways, the soil health of the Central Valley. So I think these are all parts of playing the long game, this idea of investing in a diverse human community, of thinking about how we grow a really resilient food system with the people around us that can support all of this investing in the plants and investing in the soil. And I think what that takes is moving from this paradigm of extraction and the amount of value we can extract from land, as just so deeply embedded, I think, in a lot of the mainstream agricultural institutions that we all have to navigate. And in any way that we can, moving towards a paradigm of reciprocity and really thinking about the mutual benefit between us as people on the land, with each other, with the land, with the plants. How can that be a continuous circle of sort of giving in both directions so that we all sustain, right? I think that's really got to be the goal. And when I think back to my family's history and that tragedy of the Dust Bowl, I think that's the direction we have to move in, is how do we push agriculture and society in general away from this idea of, making a quick buck? What can we extract from this piece of land? And think about ourselves as we're going to be in relationship with this land in perpetuity for generations to come. And how can we all do that together in a way that sustains the health of that land and the health of those people on and on and on? And so I want to end actually with a short passage from Lennell Underground. So this was the book that I wrote after chatting with all those folks in Montana for that growing season of 2012. And I look at it now, it's almost 10 years old, and it's kind of like a letter from my younger self. Did anybody do that in elementary school, where your teacher was like, write yourself a letter and we'll mail it to you in 10 years? And sometimes I kind of laugh at it, I was new to all this work. I was naive about some things, but the folks that I had the privilege to meet had so much wisdom to share, as you all do. There's a lot of really deep wisdom in this community, again, about agriculture, but also just about life and how to live well. And I look back at some of the things that I wrote down, that people told me that were important to me, and I realized that I've been given really a lifelong gift of some incredible teachings. So I want to share one short passage here just to close. And it has the heading, "You Can't Do It Alone." Much like a newly initiated legume farmer, I want to think that lentils are a straightforward substitute for synthetic fertilizer, a cheaper, more environmentally benign alternative. To some extent, this is true. But if that was really all there was to it, there would be no lentil underground. Just a smattering of savvy growers rationally applying plant-based nitrogen instead of expensive ammonium nitrate. But the fact is that biological fertility is more than just a different nutrient management approach. It's an entirely different way of life, one in which time and space broaden considerably, and the illusion of control falls apart. Building your soil biologically is not a precise prescription for a particular crop, but a contribution to a larger ecology, subject to independent variables, geologic time, and global biogeochemical cycles. You will not capture all the value on this farm in this year. You cannot individualize your return. To build biological fertility is to build community, to accept interdependence with other creatures and foster a common benefit. This way of life cultivates a new kind of awareness, a new empathy. You have to pay attention beyond this homestead. You have to pay attention beyond this season. Planting organic lentils and all the other crops that go with them becomes part of who you are, what you are conscious of, how you see the world. It forces you to listen more deeply, more expansively. And it softens, to some extent, the borders of the self. This is the great irony of the lentil underground, or perhaps its secret. What rugged individualism brought together, only community can sustain. When I'd asked Casey Bailey to reflect on the biggest lesson he'd learned by bucking the corporate farm industry, he paused for a full 10 seconds, then answered firmly that you can't do it alone. Thank you.